I remember the day my father called to tell me he was getting remarried. It came only 6 months after Mom's funeral, and I was struggling with the emptiness she left behind. To be frank, I didn't care if Dad found someone new. Everyone deserves to heal in their own way. What bothered me was the speed and secrecy. One moment, he was spending nights at his new girlfriend's house, and the next, he announced their marriage over a hurried phone call. Worse yet, he revealed that his new wife, Elaine, and her 2 teenage kids, Devin and Mallory, would be moving in with him. At my mother's home, the place where I had grown up and had cherished for decades. That phone call changed everything. I was living across town in a small apartment at the time, and the house was left to me in Mom's will, even though Dad was still named on the mortgage. Since he'd never contested her decision, I assumed everyone understood that I was the rightful owner now. I hadn't planned on moving in immediately, but I kept it as a sanctuary. My mother's paintings on the walls, her half-finished quilts in the sewing room, the old rocking chair that belonged to her grandmother. The idea of strangers occupying that space, especially so soon, felt deeply unsettling, but Dad insisted they had nowhere else to go. Elaine had lost her own home after divorcing her ex-husband, and her kids needed stability. I begrudgingly gave my blessing. Things seemed all right at first. Elaine tried to be polite, making small talk about my job and praising the house's charm. Devin and Mallory, both in high school, mostly kept to themselves. Devin was glued to his video games, and Mallory chatted on her phone from dawn until dusk. Dad was cheerful, maybe a bit forced, but I chalked it up to nerves. I visited on weekends to check on my mother's belongings, trying to ensure everything stayed as it was. Occasionally, I'd discover a painting moved or a piece of furniture shifted. Each time, Elaine apologized, explaining they were just reorganizing to fit their stuff in. I didn't love it, but it still felt manageable, at least initially. I tried not to worry. It was a chilly Sunday afternoon when I noticed a brand new lock on the bedroom door that used to be my mother's sewing room. Confused, I asked Dad about it. He shrugged and said Elaine requested extra security for her valuables. That explanation made little sense, but I let it slide. Over the next few weeks, more changes cropped up. A different mailbox with their last name, fresh paint in the kitchen, and even the removal of some old curtains. Each time I questioned them, Elaine insisted these updates would increase the home's value. Dad avoided looking me in the eye, muttering something about how they intended to make the place livable. I felt my jaw clench, but I tried to keep calm. Tension was rising. Eventually, my unease turned into suspicion. One afternoon, I arrived unannounced to find a couple in the living room, dressed like potential buyers, chatting with Elaine while Dad hovered awkwardly nearby. The moment I stepped in, the atmosphere grew tense. Elaine introduced them as friends from out of town, but the man had a folded property brochure in his hand. When I asked to see it, he quickly tucked it away, and Elaine let out a nervous laugh. She said it was just a pamphlet she had found online, describing comparable properties in the neighborhood. My gut told me there was more to it. That night, I confronted Dad, but he dodged my questions and headed straight to bed. I was left feeling absolutely furious. I couldn't sleep that night, replaying the scene in my head. It gnawed at me that Elaine might be marketing my house without my knowledge. I decided to check around, searching the internet for any listings that resembled my mother's property. Sure enough, I came across an online advertisement. The photo showed the living room walls that I knew so well. The listing boasted a charming Victorian home with ample space, perfect for families. The contact details were registered to a local realtor, but the description matched everything inside and out. My heart pounded as I read the asking price, an amount that seemed high enough to entice Dad into thinking this was a great deal. But it was my house, not his. This was unforgivable. The following morning, I stormed into the house, determined to confront whoever was behind the listing. Elaine was sipping coffee in the kitchen. When I slapped the printed advertisement onto the table, she had the audacity to feign ignorance. She claimed she knew nothing about a real estate listing, but her trembling hands gave her away. Dad walked in, saw the tension, and tried to steer me into the living room. I refused to budge. I demanded an explanation right there. Elaine's lips quivered as Dad finally confessed that they'd been exploring options. He insisted the house was technically half his, so he had a right to do as he pleased. The betrayal cut deeper than I ever thought possible. I felt utterly betrayed again. I reminded them both that Mom's will specified that the property should go to me. My father mumbled that he never signed off on anything and the mortgage still bore his name. Elaine stepped in, insisting they had no ill intent, that they only wanted to make life easier for everybody. She claimed I could use the money from the sale to buy a place closer to my job, that it was a win-win situation. My throat burned with anger as I realized they expected me to quietly comply. It wasn't just a house, it was my last tangible connection to my mother. I told them, in no uncertain terms, that I would fight this with every resource I had. They looked genuinely taken aback. That night, I called a lawyer friend for advice. She explained that while the will designated me the primary beneficiary, the legalities around mortgages could get complicated. Because Dad's name was on the loan, he might have partial rights unless I refinanced or fully assumed the debt. My chest tightened. It wasn't about money, it was about respect for my mother's wishes. My lawyer friend recommended sending a formal cease and desist letter to any realtor listing the property without my permission. She also urged me to gather all relevant documents, my mother's will, mortgage statements, and any communication that proved my sole ownership. I felt a pang of guilt for even having to do this, but I saw no other choice. I had to protect myself now. I showed up the next day with my lawyer's business card in hand. Dad stood in the front yard, raking leaves. Elaine peered from the porch as I informed them that I'd be taking legal action if they continued any attempt to sell the house. Dad's shoulders sagged like I'd just sucker punched him. Elaine put on a defiant face, but her eyes wavered. I half expected them to protest, but instead, Dad simply nodded, dropped the rake, and went inside without a word. Elaine followed, leaving me there in the crisp autumn air, feeling more alone than ever. I wondered if I was doing the right thing. Despite everything, I wished there was a path to resolve this without tearing us apart. The silence was deafening. Days turned into weeks. My lawyer sent formal letters to the realtor, demanding the removal of any listings. Meanwhile, Elaine and her kids seemed to avoid me entirely. Whenever I visited, the house was unusually quiet. Devin's video game console was gone, Mallory's laughter absent. I found myself wondering if they planned to leave on their own, but the beds remained unmade and Elaine's kitchenware was still in the cupboards. Dad refused to look me in the eye, offering one-word responses if I asked how he was doing. I wanted to talk to him privately, but every attempt ended with him saying he needed to rest, or that it wasn't a good time. The tension coiled around us like barbed wire. It was almost physically painful. One Sunday, I arrived to find Mallory on the porch steps, hugging her knees. She looked up with tears in her eyes and asked if I hated them. Her question stunned me. I sat beside her, cautious, remembering she was just a kid trapped in this mess. She confessed that she overheard Elaine saying the house might get sold whether I liked it or not, and she was scared they'd end up homeless if it didn't work out. Her father was no longer paying child support, and Elaine felt desperate. A rush of sympathy washed over me. It wasn't my responsibility, but I couldn't ignore the fact that these children had been tossed into a situation they never asked for. My heart ached terribly now. After Mallory's confession, I confronted Elaine privately. I told her I had no intention of leaving her children homeless, but I wouldn't be manipulated into selling. She burst into tears, admitting she saw the house as a financial lifeline. She claimed Dad was on board because he felt guilty about how quickly he remarried after my mother died. He thought giving Elaine a fresh start might ease his conscience. It all sounded messy and half-baked. When I asked if Dad truly wanted to sell, Elaine just shrugged, saying he was torn. I realized Dad had placed himself in an impossible position, balancing his own guilt against my rage and Elaine's desperation. Part of me wanted to forgive him, yet my resentment burned like live coals. That evening, Dad finally called me. His voice was shaky, like he wanted to cry, but couldn't. He apologized for everything, saying he never meant to disrespect Mom's memory. He admitted he felt overwhelmed by Elaine's financial troubles and didn't know how to juggle his new family's needs with the moral duty he felt toward me. I listened, furious yet strangely empathetic. When he asked if there was any way to keep the peace, I said the only solution was for them to stop trying to sell. He sighed heavily, agreeing to remove any unauthorized listings and drop the idea. Still, I sensed hesitation in his voice, a lingering regret that maybe he was giving up his only chance at redemption. I tried understanding him. Over the next few days, Devin and Mallory began unpacking their things again, as if the threat of eviction had lifted. Elaine avoided me, but I caught her wiping tears in the hallway once. The realtor's sign was removed from the front yard, and any online ads disappeared. For a moment, I believed we might have found a shaky truce, but a nagging voice in my head told me this wasn't over. I could see it in Dad's eyes, a flicker of longing for some miraculous way to fix all his problems. The house still felt tense, haunted by unspoken resentments. I tried to focus on the positives. Mom's memory would stay intact, and I wouldn't lose the one place that mattered most. I forced a smile. A week later, I came by unannounced once more. Dad and Elaine were sitting at the dining room table, hunched over a stack of bills. I heard hushed arguing before they noticed me. Elaine's eyes were red. Dad forced a shaky grin, asking if I wanted coffee. I declined and stood awkwardly, sensing that something was very wrong. Finally, Dad confessed that he was behind on his mortgage payments, not just for this house, but for some debts he incurred during his first months with Elaine. He wanted to protect her from the fallout, so he borrowed against his retirement fund, and that money was nearly gone. My stomach knotted. It explained why they'd been so desperate to sell. Suddenly, everything truly made a twisted sense. I hesitated, torn between outrage and pity. On one hand, they deceived me. On the other, they were drowning financially. If Dad defaulted on the mortgage, it could drag my mother's house into foreclosure. As the legalities swirled in my mind, Elaine looked up, pleading for understanding. She said they had no choice, that if they lost this place, they'd have nowhere else to go. A flicker of an idea crossed my mind. Maybe I could refinance in my name only, pay off Dad's portion, and own the house. I wasn't sure if I could afford it, but it would at least secure my inheritance. I told them I would consider it, but under the condition that all attempts to sell stopped immediately. They quickly agreed. In the weeks that followed, I worked with my lawyer to figure out a refinancing strategy. My finances were tight, and I'd need a co-signer or a hefty down payment. But I was determined not to let my mother's home slip through my fingers. Dad seemed relieved, even grateful, but Elaine remained distant. I caught her on the phone late at night, whispering in urgent tones. Devin and Mallory were cautious around me, as though unsure of their place. The day I gathered enough documents to begin the refinance process, I felt a surge of optimism. Maybe we could salvage some semblance of family after all, albeit awkwardly. But life has a way of hitting you when you least expect it. I braced for impact. A few days later, Dad collapsed in the driveway. A neighbor found him and called an ambulance. I got there as paramedics loaded him into the vehicle. Elaine stood by, shaking uncontrollably. At the hospital, we discovered he had a minor heart attack brought on by stress and exhaustion. Guilt overwhelmed me as I watched him lie in the hospital bed, tubes running from his arms. He looked fragile, more so than I'd ever seen him. Elaine sobbed that she couldn't lose another partner. Mallory and Devin hovered, terrified. I felt an odd sense of responsibility, even though none of us had caused his health issues directly. Stress had built up from the financial strain, the tension at home, and unresolved grief. My heart ached. The doctor said Dad would recover, but needed less stress. While he slept, Elaine approached me, eyes swollen. She said she and her kids would move out if it meant saving Dad's health. I hesitated, recognizing her genuine concern. After a long silence, I offered a different solution. I'd refinance in my name, fully owning the house, and Dad could stay on, free of mortgage bills. Elaine could remain if she respected Mom's will. She agreed, tears on her cheeks. When Dad was discharged, we gathered at his bedside, uncertain but united. I still felt the weight of betrayal and loss, but for now, we had a fragile peace. The house, and whatever remained of our family, would endure a little longer. I prayed we'd endure.